Our next topic is finding off-ramps to a three-way nuclear arms race. And I am so pleased to have three great colleagues and friends, more importantly, experts, to discuss this topic with us this afternoon. There's quite a bit to discuss, and although we have a lot of time, we may not explore every last facet. So I urge you to take a quick look at the biographies in your program, but I'd like to launch right into it. Starting, although we're going to talk about the US, Russia, and China, let's start with the United States and Russia. And I'm going to ask my friend Kingston Reef to talk a little bit about the importance of New START, what it achieved, the dangers of its expiration, and what the Washington and Moscow could do now, particularly in the light of positive remarks by both President Trump and President Putin. Kingston, you recently wrote a piece about what a good interim agreement would be. I wrote a similar piece last year, and I don't mean to brag, but a lot of people say I was right about everything. And so I'd like you to take it away and tell me where we are with New START and what we can do next.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Tom. Please never change, please. It's great to be back at ACA's annual meeting. I believe the last annual meeting I attended was the November 2020 iteration when I was on the ACA staff. That meeting occurred amid the height of the COVID-19 pandemic and was completely virtual, so it's great to be back with everyone in person. Also, a quick note of thanks to the entire Arms Control Association team, its board, and its members and supporters. These are difficult times, which means that your work is more important than ever. Thank you for everything that you do, and it is with great pride that I get to say I'm an Arms Control Association alum. I'm excited to join three great colleagues on this panel this afternoon for what is a very timely discussion. As Tom indicated, I'm going to focus on the value and status of New START, the risk of its expiration without any kind of follow-on arrangement, the options Presidents Trump and Putin still have in the short time remaining to address the issue, and a few considerations for possible follow-on talks. First, I want to start, though, with a quick note on the security environment. As everyone, I think, knows, nuclear weapons are increasingly salient in international politics, for the simple reason that most of the states that possess them believe the threats they face are increasing the importance of these weapons to their security. So for those of you who are working in other areas of the national security universe, you might not be interested in nuclear weapons, but they are very interested in you. I think everyone is familiar with many of the challenging trends that define the contemporary nuclear weapons and strategic forces landscape. Suffice it to say that together these trends, I think, are prompting a conversation about the core objectives and sufficiency of U.S. nuclear strategy not seen since the end of the Cold War, if not the dawn of the nuclear age. And one of these trends is that what was once a broad network of agreements intended to stabilize the U.S.-Soviet and later U.S.-Russia nuclear relationship has all but collapsed. The impact of this erosion has been magnified by extreme tension in the bilateral relationship unrelated to arms control. And only New START remains, and it is hanging by a thread. In the wake of Russia's illegal suspension of implementation of the agreement in February of 2023, and the treaty's impending expiration in less than 5 months. And if nothing is negotiated to replace the treaty, either formally or informally, there will be no limits on at least a portion of the US and Russian nuclear arsenals for the first time in decades. And this has prompted a very robust and in some ways existential conversation about what should come next for the arms control enterprise. And I'll come back to this, but first I think it's useful, as Tom asked, to kind of take stock of New START's life over the roughly past 15 years and the value it has provided to US and global security. Many of you may recall that critics predicted lots of not very good things would happen if the Senate approved the treaty and if 10 years later, the US pursued a clean 5-year extension of the treaty. I think the weight of the evidence supports the pro-New START ratification and extension cases. A few of the arguments made in 2010 were that the treaty would disproportionately benefit Russia and could endanger the US nuclear triad. New START, though, placed equal limits on both sides and required Russia to reduce its deployed warheads to meet the treaty limits. It's also plausible that in the absence of the treaty, Russia could have kept production lines open amid its churning out of new delivery systems over the past decade. The treaty also provided the Pentagon with significant flexibility to structure US deployed nuclear forces to meet the treaty limits. This is why we are in a position today, and I know we'll probably get into this topic, to quickly increase the number of deployed warheads via uploading, which has been a topic of discussion. In fact, if ACA ever convened a panel to come up with a Mount Rushmore of arms control provisions, I would nominate the combination of the Ninth Agreed Statement and Section 4 of Part 3 of the Treaty Protocol, which allowed for both the elimination of submarine-launched ballistic missile tubes from treaty accountability without destroying the launchers, and converted tubes to be located on the same boomer with launchers that had not been converted. Much to the chagrin of Russia, I might add, and will probably raise the costs in the future of any conversion type provisions in a potential new agreement. Another argument made in 2010 and during the extension debate was that the treaty didn't limit Russia's large stockpile of non-strategic warheads. But I never understood the argument that we should jettison all limits on Russian strategic forces because the agreement was not a panacea that captured all nuclear weapons, which of course it was never intended to be. Same goes for the argument that the treaty doesn't include China. But during the treaty's 15-year existence, the limits have been sufficient to meet US deterrence objectives against both Russia and China. So my net assessment is that the treaty reduced uncertainty about Russia's strategic nuclear forces, provided us with greater confidence in our own nuclear plans and capabilities. Conversely, the absence in the first place or lapse in 2020 of the treaty would have reduced our insight into what Russia was doing, opened the door to unconstrained nuclear competition between the world's two largest nuclear powers, damaged relations with our allies, exacerbated what not long after the treaty's entry into force became a fraught post-reset US-Russia bilateral relationship, and undermined US nonproliferation objectives. In the end, factors outside the scope and control, obviously, of the treaty ultimately became too much for the agreement to overcome. And these include the onset of the COVID pandemic in early 2020, which put the treaty inspections on ice, they remain on ice, and Russia's unconscionable invasion of Ukraine. And despite the Herculean efforts of two of our panel members and several audience members, there was no meaningful forward progress following the treaty's signature on strategic arms control to go beyond New START, the vast majority of the blame for which resides and belongs in Moscow. Which brings us to the current moment. With New START set to expire in less than 5 short months, there may be an opportunity for some interim progress. After returning to office earlier this year, President Trump wasted little time in calling for negotiations with both Russia and China to, quote, denuclearize in a very big way, end quote. And then in July, when asked about the expiration of New START, the president said, quote, that is a big problem for the world. When you take off nuclear restrictions, that's a big problem, end quote. In a little notice shift, Russian President Putin earlier this year called for bilateral engagement on arms control without explicitly insisting on a full halt to US military aid to Ukraine as a precondition, which in the past has been a Russian precondition. And earlier this week, I think as many of you may know, Putin said Russia is ready to continue to adhere to the central quantitative restrictions under New START for 1 year after February 5th, 2026. So far, so mum from President Trump in response, and Leslie, thank you for your attention to this matter on the topic since the panel began. So if you had said anything in the last few minutes, please let us know. Obviously, reaching any new agreements, especially one that includes China, will take time. To buy some time, I think there remains value in continued restraints on Russian strategic nuclear forces, a resumption of transparency with regard to those forces, reopening communications channels between the two sides on strategic matters, putting the diplomatic heat on China for continuing to stand on the arms control sidelines, and sending a broader signal to the international community that the world's two largest nuclear powers can still cooperate to reduce nuclear risks. And I think 3 steps could help do this. First, the two sides could resume implementation of New START for the remainder of its duration. Second, they could resume a dialogue on strategic stability to address perceptions of the strategic balance discuss risk reduction measures, and identify objectives for more far-reaching agreements to replace New START. And third, the two sides could make a political commitment to adhere to the New START limits and exchange related treaty data beyond its expiration date while they seek to negotiate a new agreement and bring China into the fold. How realistic are these suggestions, given New START's current moribund state and in the absence of a diplomatic process to discuss an end to Russia's war in Ukraine, or at least a meaningful process at this time? I don't know. At a minimum, it will require the two presidents to engage in some compartmentalization and put the issue high up on their agendas. And even if an agreement is reached along these lines, it's questionable whether it can be viable for long in the absence of progress in the broader relationship and a follow-on arms control process. Meanwhile, understandable objections have been raised to this approach. The main one is that the significant and projected continued growth of China's nuclear arsenal, in particular its construction of hundreds of new silo-based ICBMs, requires an upward adjustment in U.S. deployed strategic forces above the New START limits. And this is due to the exigencies of U.S. targeting requirements and fulfillment of the damage limitation requirement for U.S. nuclear forces, a topic that I know Steve will probably be interested in addressing. I take the points that there is nothing magical or sacrosanct about 1,550 warheads, and that New START was negotiated in a world that has changed markedly over the past 15 years. But in the near term, and by that I mean at least the next 3 to 5 years, I don't see a pressing deterrence need for an increase. Happy to go into more detail on why I think that, and I know Steve will provide some thoughts on that. I think we're all waiting to see, though, what the Trump administration says and does with respect to U.S. nuclear policy and requirements. We may get some more clarity on this with the impending release of the National Defense Strategy from the Pentagon and the nuclear policy review that was nested underneath that, or we may not. We'll see. In the remaining time that I have, I would just like to briefly address some of the issues that are likely to arise in the context of new negotiations and seeking to bring China and Russia into the process. First, what should be the goal of arms control in this new security landscape? Deeper reductions, covering more classes of weapons, broadening into new domains, including more countries, or a narrower focus on predictability, transparency, and establishing norms of behavior? A related question is what form or forms should agreements take and how long should they last? And what are we willing to trade away to achieve certain objectives that have long been on the to-do list? Arms control is, of course, a tool and not an end in and of itself. It is a means to manage competition and even a means to enhance U.S. competitive advantages in certain areas. And it's a tool, I think, that retains considerable value. There is value and limitations on Russia's strategic forces, on Russia's nuclear forces, even if not on every subset of them. There is value and transparency on those forces. And there is value in seeking more information on and predictability with respect to China's buildup. There is value here, especially in light of the limitations on the U.S. ability to compete in this area over the next decade, if not longer. Briefly on numbers, and I hope I'm invited back after I say this. It is certainly possible that as the nuclear enterprise does its work, as our domestic political debate does its work, as our allies weigh in, and as China continues to build to the levels in current U.S. projections, that what emerges is a proposal for a follow-on arrangement with Russia that includes a higher limit on deployed strategic weapons or a higher range of limits than New START, and that the duration of the agreement is shorter than previous agreements to hedge against uncertainty about how much higher China could go. This would, of course, be a reversal of the trend in previous agreements since the end of the Cold War of progressively lower limits. But that does not mean there wouldn't be value in such an arrangement in providing stability, predictability, and transparency, especially relative to the alternative of no agreement. With respect to China, there's lots that could be said. Just one quick thing for now is as we think about something more robust with China, I think trying to get a handle on where the endpoint of China's arsenal growth is going to be would be hugely valuable. My biggest concern with respect to China is less the specifics of their buildup and more the uncertainty about its trajectory. Where do they plan to stop? It's not clear they know that, and they may see value in being opaque. But if we knew, for example, that China would stop at what the current projections are, at least the current US projections, that would provide much needed confidence and predictability and help to avoid worst case scenario planning on our part. But if we go down this road, China will likely want us to put some things on the table in return. Two more topics Missile defense, I'm looking forward to hearing what Mallory has to say on this. Certainly, I think it will need to be addressed in any negotiation. I think the conventional wisdom is that Golden Dome, at least in its maximalist conceptions, and arms control are incompatible. I'm not quite so sure. For those of you who are Dune fans out there, to quote Paul Atreides, I do see a very narrow way through, and I'll just leave that hanging for now. And then finally, on non-strategic nuclear weapons. They've long been considered a must-do in any New START follow-on, but we should weigh the benefits versus the complexity and costs of doing business here. Others have pointed this out, but given in particular Russia's theory of victory, we seem most worried about, and that's the so-called escalate to win concept. How much would reductions help address that? I think we might get the biggest bang for the buck on exchanges and notifications, on-site visits, perhaps consolidation of storage locations, transparency along those lines. So there's no shortage of work to do, Tom, and I've put a lot of topics on the table to discuss. Looking forward to coming back to some of them, but back to you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Kingston. So, Dr. Fetter, Steve, thanks for being here. I think we'll come back to some of the China questions in a second round, but if we could stay on the New START agreement in particular. We already have some discussion in Washington about preparing to upload additional warheads in the event of New START expiration. I've already seen a report from the Heritage Foundation that I found positively Orwellian in its vocabulary, because it said talking to the Russians would be reckless, but loading a couple hundred more warheads would be prudent. It seems a little backwards to me, but recognizing that there is a serious debate among people who are more expert in the arcane but important topics of targeting and damage limitation. I'm interested in your views of what would be the real effects of an unrestrained growth, and whether the US and Russia moving rapidly to deploy additional warheads would increase the national security of either country.
Well, thanks, Tom. And let me say, it's so good to be in a room filled with supporters of arms control in these times. So as Kingston mentioned, and also Tom just mentioned, there are calls across the political spectrum for the U.S. to increase its deployed strategic forces after New START expires in February, including calls by some friends and colleagues of mine. The proposed numbers vary from perhaps about 2,200 to over 3,000, or an increase of 50 to 100%. And the rationale for those increases also varies. Some argue that we need additional warheads to deter Russia, North Korea, but really the focus has been, as Kingston mentioned, on China, and in particular the 350 new silos that China has built. If you haven't already read it, I would recommend the article in a recent Foreign Affairs by Vipin Narang and Pranay Vadi. Not because I agree with it, but because it is the most explicit about the rationale for increasing U.S. nuclear forces. They explain that the goal of U.S. nuclear targeting is to limit damage to the United States by attempting to destroy adversary nuclear forces in command and control. In other words, counterforce targeting. And they argue that a strategy of damage limitation through counterforce is necessary for extended deterrence to be credible to both allies and to adversaries. If the U.S. accepts that it's not possible to limit damage, then threats to escalate to the use of nuclear weapons or to escalate to greater use of nuclear weapons wouldn't be credible, because they would amount to suicide if we believed we couldn't prevent the destruction of our homeland. They believe that by making threats of escalation more credible, U.S. nuclear forces can provide bargaining power in a crisis. So in this view, the United States needs to be able to target all adversary nuclear forces. So if China adds 350 silos, then the US needs additional warheads, at least 350, probably 700 warheads, so that we could target 2 warheads on every silo. So instead of 1 warhead on every ICBM, you would have 3. You would need 3. Or instead of 4 warheads on each Trident missile, you would need 8. So that consideration alone would require the deployment of an additional 700 to 1,000 warheads. So the most straightforward response to this argument is something Charlie Glazer and James Acton and I made in a Foreign Affairs article on why we don't need more missiles, why we don't need more warheads. And the core of that, the most straightforward argument, is that damage limitation is not possible, and that counterforce decreases U.S. security. So, even if the U.S. could destroy every silo-based ICBM, every submarine import, every bomber, every strategic bomber, enough Russian and Chinese warheads would survive to destroy the United States as a functioning society. But the U.S. can't destroy every silo-based ICBM. It's more likely that those ICBMs would be launched before they could be destroyed, either before a U.S. strike or shortly after it's detected. In fact, the U.S. maintains a launch-on warning capability precisely for this purpose, as does Russia. And it's widely assumed that China either has or will soon have such a capability. So the requirement, I should put that in air quotes, the requirement that the U.S. be able to target every ICBM silo does nothing to limit damage to the United States, because a U.S. strike against those silos would be more likely to trigger the launch of the ICBMs against the U.S., vastly increasing damage to the U.S. So as we argue in our article, increasing nuclear forces to try to achieve a damage limitation capability through counterforce is likely to decrease U.S. security by providing incentives for the rapid and large-scale use of nuclear weapons, and by leading Russia and China to increase their nuclear forces. But we also acknowledge in our article that this frontal assault on counterforce is unlikely to be persuasive because it's so deeply ingrained in U.S. strategic culture. And so I'd like to offer a few other arguments for why we don't need or won't add, why we don't need more warheads. The first is a little subtle, a little inside baseball. In a review of nuclear policy that was conducted in the Obama administration about 2012, it was decided that the deployed U.S. strategic forces could be reduced by a third, from 1,550 to about 1,000. That was in the context of a follow-on agreement to New START that would limit Russia to a similar number, but the parity was a political requirement, not a military technical requirement. There was no expectation that a follow-on treaty would reduce the number of Russian targets by a third. So the review must have concluded that the U.S. could deter Russia with a smaller force. And if that's so, we already have a surplus against Russia that could be directed at China. Another argument, which I think is really key, is that an increase in U.S. nuclear forces will trigger a three-way arms race. And of course, that's the title of this session. If the U.S. increases the number of deployed strategic warheads by 1,000, Russia and China will conclude they have to increase their forces to maintain an adequate deterrent. And those increases in Russian and Chinese forces would be used to justify further increases in U.S. forces, and so on and so on. The advocates of increases in U.S. forces maintain, well, that won't necessarily happen. But that seems to be a combination of wishful thinking and mirror imaging. For example, some have argued that because the U.S. would increase the number of warheads by uploading existing missiles, or by building in the longer term additional subs and bombers, we would be adding any new aim points. The number of missile silos and sub and bomber bases would remain the same, and so Russia wouldn't require any additional warheads. I doubt that Russia or China are going to see it that way. At a minimum, they will believe that an increased number of U.S. warheads will erode their retaliatory capabilities, requiring a buildup on their side. Russia often mentions the balance of deterrence and principles of equality, which suggests they will insist on parity. And the substantial increase in, or a substantial increase in national missile defense, such as that called for by Golden Dome, are likely to cause Russia and China to push for more offensive warheads just to maintain the same retaliatory capability. U.S. missile defense was the rationale for the new Russian weapons that we complain about, Sarmat, the Avangard hyperglide vehicle, the nuclear-powered torpedo and cruise missile. And it's probably the rationale for the buildup of Chinese nuclear forces that is well underway. And in fact, Russia's statement that it just made about extending the New START limits or extending observance of the New START limits notes that U.S. plans to expand missile defense could nullify our efforts to maintain the status quo. So that's another argument. Another argument, though, is just practical. The U.S. is already struggling to modernize its current nuclear force. Sentinel is greatly delayed. Minuteman may be deployed until 2050. The only warhead that can be uploaded on Minuteman is the W-78, which is near the end of its lifetime. In fact, rather than extend that warhead, the decision was made to build a new warhead for Sentinel, but that warhead will be delayed by the need to fabricate new pits. So it's not clear when additional ICBM warheads would be available. It is possible to upload Trident, but that would place even greater reliance on the W-76, and the higher warhead loading will limit targeting and patrol flexibility. A new warhead for Trident is under development, but that also will have to wait for new pit production. Some have suggested reactivating the 4 tubes on each submarine that Kingston mentioned, but that would take time and is not so easy to accomplish. And others have mentioned deploying additional submarines, but that would have to wait until the end of the submarine build in 2045. So the options for a significant increase in deployed strategic forces are limited for the next 10 or 15, maybe even 20 years. So it doesn't make sense to me to refuse to adhere to the New START limits when our options for deploying more warheads are so limited. My final argument is purely political. Trump is obviously campaigning for a Nobel Prize. When he has spoken about nuclear weapons, as Kingston mentioned, it has been about the need for denuclearization or even elimination. And one thing we know about this administration is that the boss is always correct. Even if Hegseth and everyone below him was convinced of the need to deploy more warheads, they won't contradict the boss. And Senate Republicans will fall in line as they have on every other issue. And now Trump's good friend, Vladimir Putin, has offered to continue to observe the New START limits if Trump reciprocates. And I hope that would seal the deal. So that's 5 arguments for not increasing nuclear warheads. I certainly hope that some combination of those sticks. So, thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. I wanted to ask former Assistant Secretary Mallory Stewart, my good colleague, to talk especially about Golden Dome. The senator already noted the distinction between the ambitious goals of Golden Dome to prove an impervious shield to any aerial attack versus the more limited goal of a specific area defense against specific threats. The more ambitious goal, as I already noted, is not one that physicists believe is possible. Steve has written a great piece on exactly that. Defense industry executives and politicians may disagree about what's possible. And of course, we have a president and a Congress who are ready to be big spenders with the future tax revenues from our grandchildren to pay for the dome. I'm interested not only in what you see as positive, as feasible, what you see as impractical, what you see as expensive, and what might the effects be on strategic stability among these three great powers?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tom, and thank you to the Arms Control Association. It's lovely to see so many colleagues, former president, and hopefully future collaborators in the audience. First, I should caveat that there are a number of open questions about Golden Dome. We have not yet seen the necessary strategy or details. We don't know aspects of what would be prioritized, and there are numerous and varied paths forward that would affect some of the answers to your questions, and also I was told there'd be no math. But in his recent American Enterprise Institute working paper, Todd Harrison provided a useful framework for thinking about Golden Dome. This paper was about how the different prioritizations under Golden Dome could vastly affect divergent financial outcomes, costs and implications to the tune of billions and billions of difference between the paths forward. To quote him specifically, he says, "In the end, Golden Dome's cost will not be determined by fiscal constraints or technical capabilities, but by political choices, which risks leaders are willing to mitigate, which they are willing to trade, and which they are prepared to accept." So that's a possible framework in which we could consider Golden Dome by taking off political hats and analyzing and understanding the Golden Dome's risk trade-offs. Hopefully we can help do what this community is good at doing, which is working to reduce the risks for the US and our allies and partners, and hopefully helping to reduce the risks to the global community. So any new strategic system, as we've heard and as we've discussed, offensive or defensive, certainly has significant implications for our foreign policy and will complicate our relationships with Russia and China, if not directly fuel ongoing security spirals. In this way, Golden Dome is no exception. But Golden Dome is certainly unique in drastically changing the way we have thought about missile defense for the past 2 decades. And many of you know this history, so I'll go through it very quickly. Since 2002, which I comment on because my kids think it's numerous lifetimes ago, but it is not, when the US pulled out of the ABM treaty, we've seen a change in our approach to missile defense, right? Under the ABM treaty, the US and Russia had a certain level of mutual restraint. Mutual commitment to restrain defenses for the purposes of strategic stability analysis. However, post-2002, our approach has been quite different. The limited US deployed missile defense capabilities were directed against rogue states and regional threats. We focus primarily on limited capacities to prevent the one-off or two-off and maybe a couple more missile capacities that would come at us from North Korea, potentially, or Iran. Despite repeated assurances to Russia that our missile defense architectures were not directed at them, and of course that our deployed missile defense interceptor numbers didn't even come close to the allowed limit under the ABM treaty, Russia had deep concern about our missile defenses all along. So the negotiators from Russia repeatedly sought legally binding guarantees that our missile defenses would not be aimed at them. We repeatedly assured them that they were not aimed at them, but we could not give them these legally binding commitments. In the New START treaty, which we've been discussing, the preamble provided a direct recognition of the interrelation between strategic offenses and defenses, addressing this concern from Russia to the degree that we were able to address it. Certainly the Biden administration's national security policies, including the Missile Defense Review, recognize the interrelationship between offensive and defensive capabilities. Russian concerns persisted. Despite us being very clear with the limited purpose for our missile defense, trying to show as much as possible they were not directed nor had the capability to affect Russia's nuclear deterrent, including its ability to engage in nuclear retaliation, Russia was still deeply concerned. And we know this because Russia responded, again, light years after 2002 in 2018, with Vladimir Putin announcing that Russia had actually developed these 6 novel super weapons, that Kingston just mentioned, and also Steve, that we've seen this strategic capability development, specifically, as Putin said, to restore Russia's nuclear deterrence capability in the face of American technological developments following America's withdrawal from the ABM treaty, which again, my kids would say, they're still talking about that, and yes, they are. So against this background of this history of concern, let's very quickly, to lay a baseline of commonality, look at what the Golden Dome proposal is. So Golden Dome is intended to be a state-of-the-art, multi-layered missile defense system. I'm using some quotes here. The effort is recognized as an engineering integration challenge, but through massive integration complexity, the success will seamlessly integrate all missile defense pieces and organizations, connecting our existing systems, Aegis, GMD, THAAD, Patriot, with new space-based assets. The threat coverage is designed to counter the full spectrum of sophisticated missile threats from adversaries, including North Korea and Iran, but specifically like China and Russia, and to address those long-range cruise missiles, hypersonic glide missiles, MIRVs, and even systems launched from space, including the newly developed fractional orbital bombardment systems. So it's really a layered defense approach, having launch disruption at pre-launch phase, boost phase, mid-course, terminal phase. Maximizing interception success is the effort. And the inclusion of space-based assets is a defining feature that grants unique advantages over existing systems. Again, this is how this Golden Dome presentation is being perceived. What I do want to point out here before we go into a discussion of the risk trade-offs is that ultimately bringing our existing missile defense architectures together, making them more cohesive and able to speak to each other in ways that they haven't, is sort of a main point for those that advocate for Golden Dome. That uniting in a layered way our existing missile defense architecture, which hadn't previously been directed or even capable of addressing global threats, broad targeting threats, is something that the Golden Dome advocates support very importantly. But of course, there is an acknowledgement that for every defensive approach, there's an even more creative offensive approach. And so back to Todd Harrison's point, that, quote, the issue for policymakers is not whether the nation can build an impenetrable shield, because it cannot, but how to balance the risks. Okay, so with that background, the Golden Dome initiative inherently involves significant risk trade-offs. And I hope to discuss here three sort of major arenas for those risk trade-offs, but there are many more. So the first one that I want to discuss is the strategic stability versus a political sort of a homeland security, a sense of security context. And really the frustrations that have been building on both sides of this conversation. The second trade-off that I may or may not get to, as well as the third, are interrelated, the budgetary allocation and opportunity cost, or the high cost versus the uncertain feasibility and uncertainty of political will supporting this. And then the third one, deployment speed versus system reliability. So three large buckets. And if I only get to the first one, we can discuss during question and answer some of the other two bucket points. So, of course, the perceived benefit of protecting the U.S. homeland should be measured against the risk of undermining strategic relationships and accelerating the global arms race. We've already heard about this. And Steve mentioned Putin's comment that particular attention must be directed towards the U.S. plans to expand strategic components of missile defense systems, while he said at the same time he could continue the caps of New START treaty. He specifically said that, such destabilizing measures as missile defense could nullify our efforts in the arms control arena. And there have been explicit warnings from our adversaries throughout. Russia, China, and North Korea have all warned the Golden Dome could disrupt strategic stability and might spark a dangerous arms race. Russia and China issued a joint statement condemning Golden Dome, creating a hardly surmountable obstacle to the constructive consideration of nuclear arms control. There's been numerous comments that Golden Dome reflected a rejection of this important relationship, inseparable interrelationship between strategic offensive and strategic defensive arms, which we discussed Russia deeply cares about. Russia and China have expressed concern that the initiative fundamentally challenges the nuclear balance by creating a scenario where the U.S. might negate a retaliatory strike. They claim that the U.S. seeks a first strike capability wherein Golden Dome would intercept a radically weakened retaliatory strike after a conventional or non-nuclear strike, heightening the danger of destabilization and undermining the threat of nuclear retaliation. All of us in this room have often heard either ourselves or others discuss the long-standing understanding that deploying missile interceptors can lead to buildup of more numerous and sophisticated offensive missile systems, decoys, multiple warheads, and that the lower cost and faster rate of these offensive systems could overwhelm and evade missile defenses, but also lead to a long-term challenge for the defending system. And finally, the threat of additional space weaponization. There's been numerous conversations about militarization of space, and that the concern that missile defense interceptors, the concern that space-based sensors and interceptors will directly exacerbate what is an existing and ongoing arms race in outer space. But we also need to consider the other side. We know that China and Russia have space control capabilities. We know that there is an effort, at least according to the US government, and strongly felt understanding that there is a Russian effort to develop a nuclear-armed anti-satellite capacity that would deeply affect any space-based systems. Advocates for Golden Dome, again, identify several advantages. And this goes back to our discussion in the beginning that providing comprehensive defense against advanced threats, finally recognizing that Russia and China have their own missile defense capabilities that are certainly directed against incoming challenges from the United States and the West. And yet we have focused primarily on, again, regional threats, more limited challenges from countries such as DPRK and Iran. There's a concern that in the advocates for Golden Dome that there's been strategic atrophy. We've heard inklings of this from the two prior speakers, and that Golden Dome could drive innovation and economic benefits in the commercial space arena, and then have a dual use purpose to protect our space assets. Basically, they argue there's already an arms race happening. It's happening on Earth and in space. Russia and China have their own missile defenses, specifically targeting US capabilities. And to not acknowledge a changed circumstance here is not to address the ongoing threats that we face in this arena. Now, I'm not suggesting that that offsets the risk of strategic stability, the risk of destabilizing our relationships and the strategic balance. But what we need to do is figure out how to address some of the arguments that this Golden Dome concept has sort of fed into, that we need to protect our homeland. We need to figure out how to affect an ability to prevent the threatened use of nuclear weapons, as we saw in the Ukraine context, how to complicate the calculus in potential strategic competitors to prevent coercive challenges when we right now are in a situation we take those threats, and we potentially seen that to a certain degree, depending on who you ask, limit our ability to respond, potentially in the Ukraine context and in others. So where can we change some of these incentive structures? Is there a way to manage nuclear escalation by providing an additional rung? And is there something to be learned from the Golden Dome advocates as to what we can do in this context? Again, I think the challenge of addressing the concerns of our strategic competitors, the challenge of recognizing some of the benefits of Golden Dome, if they exist, really stem from the one potential path forward, and that is engagement, discussion, description, and clarity as to what the Golden Dome project is. Right? There's an argument in the Golden Dome community that it can also support our alliances, right? We bring Canada in more through a NORAD collaboration. We talk about regional missile defense systems from our allies being coordinated and brought into the Golden Dome architecture. We have a possibility to extend a sense of security to our allies in closer collaboration. But again, none of this is possible if we keep our understanding of what Golden Dome can do to ourselves, and if we don't discuss why there is a need or some perceived desire for this system. So I would just say that in analyzing these risks, this community specifically has to evaluate how there is going to be a security spiral continuing to be driven, even by discussions of Golden Dome without greater clarification. At the same time, there's a need to explain the reason for the advocates for Golden Dome seeing this as a necessary development. And I think we have to figure out how we approach that. My understanding is that the Trump administration will certainly claim success no matter how this Golden Dome program rolls forward. It successfully achieved collaboration. It successfully made things more golden in a world in which they were not. And we in this community have to really put the risks in the same sort of context of saying, yes, there could be success here, but if we don't take the long-term continual arms race into account, if we don't take the feelings of instability, the true lack of belief by Russia that our missile defenses are anything except hoping to negate entirely their strategic deterrent, then we further exacerbate instability that has existed for many years, again, since the decades-old position of 2002. So finally, the trade-off between budgetary allocation and opportunity costs and the deployment speed versus system reliability, all of the concepts you've heard before. I'll just clarify two things. One, that Senator Tim Sheehy, when he announced plans to form the Golden Dome caucus, said in his best estimate, it will likely cost in the trillions if and when Golden Dome is completed. So there is an acknowledgement. This is a purported supporter, the Golden Dome caucus sort of lead, is acknowledging this could potentially cost an astronomical amount. Aaron Miles, in a recent, very technical report from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, Center for Global Security Research, concluded that current defense technologies are far from meeting the necessary cost reductions to achieve stability against capable adversaries. And he particularly noted that space-based systems require unit cost to be reduced by factors of 40 to nearly 300 to be economically competitive and to deter an offense-defense arms race. He also emphasized that defenses against large-scale attacks can only be effective if they are demonstrably more affordable for the U.S. than the adversaries to counter. Otherwise, the U.S. risks undermining its security and driving itself into bankruptcy based on its efforts to make Golden Dome operational. These budgetary challenges are vast cost discrepancies. We've seen anywhere from $100 billion to trillions, again mentioned. We've seen the question on sustainability of funding, budget trade-offs, bureaucratic and acquisition headwinds are going to be a really big problem. A need for sustained political will, which of course we cannot be convinced of. And finally, the trade-off on deployment speed and system reliability is a huge problem. The rapid development versus the rigorous testing required, integration challenges with rapid fielding, all of these things are driving against each other. In a risk analysis world, we have to look at both sides and understand how we can minimize those. So I'll stop there because I could unfortunately talk for hours about this, but I feel like that's enough to get the conversation started.
Okay, thank you so much, Mallory. Let me note, I'll make a quick comment on Golden Dome, and then we will go back to our panelists. And in the second round, I want to talk specifically about China, and I'll ask Kingston first about the idea of trilateral negotiation or discussion. I try to save time for a couple of questions from the audience. There'll only be time for a couple, I think. If you have a really good question, please jot it down and hand it to one of our staff. I'll note on Golden Dome, I continue to talk to non-government experts in both China and Russia, and there's very mixed feelings there about the Golden Dome proposal. On the one hand, they have physicists too, and they know it's not going to work. And spending trillions of US dollars on such a system means the US is not doing other things to compete either military or economically with China and Russia. So some people welcome it. On the other hand, it justifies the point of view of those who make nuclear policy in those countries, which are primarily the military, to increase spending and increase arsenals. So the reaction among those that we seek to compete with is very mixed. I see something in the American psyche that finds it very hard to accept the fact that we are vulnerable, that there is no defense against nuclear missiles. And in a political atmosphere that rewards strength and masculinity, it's kind of unavoidable that people are going to say, we refuse to accept that we are potential victims. It's a hard truth that I try to share with American people, but it's not easily accepted. Let's have perhaps shorter comments from each of you about the third leg of the triangle, China and its increase in its arsenal. I think we are already in a three-way nuclear arms race that, in my estimation, will exceed in cost and danger anything that we saw during the Cold War. China perhaps running faster than the US and Russia at the moment. Start with Kingston. Is there any prospect for a meaningful three-way discussion among China, the United States, and the Russian Federation?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think three things I'd say at the top just to establish, I think, some ground truth. First, the significant growth in China's nuclear stockpile is real, number one. Two, it is not consistent with China's obligations under the NPT. And three, that the past refrain from China that it will only get off the sidelines when the US and Russia have further reduced, I think is less credible with each additional warhead that is added to China's stockpile. All that being said, I think it continues to be unrealistic in the near term to expect progress in the pursuit of a trilateral agreement with the United States, Russia, and China that seeks to limit the size of each of the nation's arsenals. I think Mallory and other colleagues in the Biden administration had it right in aiming to begin a conversation on stability topics, on doctrinal topics, on crisis management, on how the pathways by which and through which escalation could get out of control. And that remains, I think, a good goal to pursue today. And I think that conversation can happen in parallel with pursuit of a discussion with the Russians on what a post-New START framework and a post-New START arms control process might look like. Now, the two are going to have to be linked, as I alluded to in my remarks. The U.S., given the conversation that's going on about the sufficiency of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, there may be a point at which let me rephrase, the limits that the U.S. might be willing to agree to are going to have to take China's force size into account. I think that's unavoidable and undeniable. But I think there can be two tracks. Rose Gadamer has written about this, dual tracks that can be pursued, both to seek to continue to have constraints and restraints on Russia's arsenal, as well as to seek to begin a process with China.
Okay. Let me ask, Mallory, you actually held a formal arms control consultation with China in late 2023. I think that followed a meeting between President Xi and President Biden, which may have been the immediate reason it was possible to do that. I'm interested in your comments about that, as much as you care to reveal why it didn't go further, and what prospects do we have for having a consultation, a meeting, a discussion, a warm cup of coffee together. I mean, my own opinion is that I have seen over the years dozens of meetings that never happened because the two sides could not agree on an agenda and sometimes even on the title of the meeting. And I hope that there may be an opportunity for people from two governments to sit down without publicity, without a press release after, without any capital letters in the title of the meeting, and just start talking. If you think that's a possible prospect, I'd like to be encouraged.
I've always been in the camp of not giving up on that possible prospect, right? I think it's always odd to me that there is a persistent belief that engagement somehow, or the desire for engagement, indicates weakness. I don't understand that. You're not conceding anything in the engagement. As long as you don't engage with the expectation that it will stop you from forward progress on something. And I'm mindful in this context of the presidential meeting between Trump and Putin delaying, I think, our ability to continue supporting Ukraine, or to in any way hold Russia accountable for its continued war on Ukraine. We still haven't seen sanctions, and there is an argument that maybe that engagement prevented Trump from taking stronger actions, and I think that's unfortunate. Putting that aside, as long as the engagement does not prevent the leadership from taking actions it feels it has to take until the engagement changes that understanding, engagement in and of itself is not weakness. To your point, Tom, I think that we were able to make progress with China on certain things. There was a meeting, that we were actually building up to between our presidents after our November 2023 risk reduction engagement. And more importantly, we were able to actually make forward progress after that meeting. We started having our military-to-military engagements, which is one of the things we asked them for at the meeting. They gave the first missile launch notification in 44 years of an ICBM that went the other direction, not over their territory. We had asked them for missile launch notifications. We talked to them about a continuing dialogue on our combined space threat perceptions, understanding that both a nuclear weapon in space would deeply affect all of us, but also that our the space threat perceptions were, it was in our mutual interest to understand what we saw, what we weren't seeing, where our concerns were. That didn't play out. I wish we had had more time, but hopefully that is something that could be discussed going forward. And we also talked about restarting our chem-bio threat perception dialogues that had also continued up until the Biden administration and the previous Trump administration. And that also didn't have a chance to proceed, but we were able to talk about those issues on the sidelines of multilateral engagements after that, and we were able at least to present our position on certain concerns and hear their concerns. Your question is why it didn't go forward. There were a lot of factors, unfortunately, a lot of complicating political statements, a tension with respect to our relationship with China that continued, I think, to build on itself. And again, this undercurrent of seeking engagement, desiring arms control somehow puts us in a more vulnerable position. And I think we should fight against that. I think we should say we are desiring stability in our relationship, preventing risk and miscalculation, unintentional escalation, which is in nobody's interest. We are not weaker for striving towards that. We are stronger, and we are trying to be collectively stronger and build our relationship through that understanding. So I hope that answers your question, but it was really deeply unfortunate we weren't able to continue that conversation, I hope, And I continue to be optimistic that those conversations can continue, both in the track 2 and hopefully eventually in the track 1.
I mean, my own observation is, look, Washington and Moscow never stopped talking about nuclear issues from 1963 until about 2014, because one leader after another in both capitals recognized this is existential. There is nothing more important than preventing a nuclear war. There are still leaders who say there is nothing more important than preventing a nuclear war. But the Russians say there is nothing more important than preventing a nuclear war, except Ukraine is importanter. China says there's nothing more important than preventing a nuclear war, except Taiwan is more important. And if you are annoying us about Taiwan, we can't talk to you today. I'm not quite sure how to get past that. Steve, I welcome your thoughts on how much the Chinese buildup actually changes the equation, what it may or may not reveal about China's stated nuclear doctrine.
Well, I think the main issue is the one that Kingston mentioned, not knowing when it will stop, when the modernization expansion will stop, and not really knowing a lot about the underlying rationale for it. I have my own guesses. I had long admired the Chinese approach to nuclear deterrence. They had decided for many decades that nuclear deterrence of the United States and Russia was relatively easy to achieve, and through a minimum deterrent force. They emphasized no first use, which I have long thought was a smart approach to it. And so it's dismaying to see this big expansion. And I think what may, before I mentioned missile defense, but also I did notice that in the 2000s that Chinese scholars and strategists would often comment on the U.S. refusal to acknowledge mutual vulnerability. It was not stated, for example, even in the Obama NPR. And that was a significant omission. And, the Chinese scholars read the American literature. They can read American strategists who say how important it is to have superiority so that we can coerce other countries in a crisis if we have nuclear superiority, so that we can credibly threaten to escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. There's really, no shortage of articles that make this point. And so I think perhaps the Chinese leadership decided to disabuse us of that notion that they were going to build up to a level that would make it clear that there was no combination of counterforce and missile defense that would remove U.S. vulnerability to the Chinese deterrent. And in a crisis, the U.S. wouldn't be able to credibly threaten to escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. So that's my guess about what's underlying it. If that's the case, then perhaps this current buildup will come to an end soon, because I think we're already well past the threshold where we could believe, where the U.S. planners could believe that we could somehow be immune to China's nuclear forces.
Thanks. I mean, one of the things that disturbs me about China's buildup is it illustrates more vividly that none of the N5, the recognized nuclear powers, is currently meeting its legal obligation under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Each of the five has an argument as to, it's not our fault, it's the other guy's fault. But there's 180 nations that don't accept that argument, and that it bothers me, and it leads to deterioration of the most important treaty in the nuclear sphere. I'm going to adapt some of the questions I've received, which are all good. There's a bit of an obstacle on the U.S. side as well, more than one, of course, to having meaningful discussions about reducing nuclear risk. As I said, it's always difficult to agree on the agenda. We insist we will talk about this and you have to as well, but we are not going to talk about that, no matter what you say. One of the things that it has been difficult or impossible for U.S. negotiators to talk about is ballistic missile defense. It is such a shibboleth in the U.S. Congress that we will never agree to an agenda that includes it. Is there a way around that? Maybe not going all the way back to the ABM treaty, but at least having a dialogue with the Russians that says, we're going to talk about all these things, you're going to talk about the things you want to talk about, and we will have an initial discussion. Do you think under this administration or a future administration we can do that? I'll start with Mallory.
I hope so. I mean, I think that's the only chance we have. If Russia is reaching out and saying we want to continue potentially a strategic stability dialogue, and that's the most recent implication from Putin, that we should take advantage of that and talk about the things we want to talk about and have them talk about the things they want to talk about, but actually try to see where there is some commonality. We get caught up in semantics, we get caught up in sort of the agenda and what it says and who gets which advantage. And I feel like the opportunity is now. And back to Rose Gottemüller's article, with this president who has such a control of our Congress, some of these traditional sticking points may not be as significant. And so this is the time to continue a strategic stability conversation, to try to address some of these concerns. And while certainly are not going to get to legally binding restraints on our missile defense capacity anytime soon, understand across the table why Russia cares so much and explain to them why we think we're in an imbalanced situation where they're allowed to have missile defenses and somehow we're not. Missile defenses that address our threats, and we want missile defenses that address their threats. So I think it is a good time to try. I very much hope that this most recent sort of outreach by President Putin is received.
Yeah. I mean, I noted earlier that some of the best people from the most experienced in negotiation are no longer in their positions, but I didn't mean to imply that we don't have some really brilliant people in the Department of State and elsewhere who are capable of working on these questions. And I would hope that they get some direction from the Secretary of State to work on these issues and be ready for a multifaceted dialogue with Russia and with China.
Can I say something really quickly
Yes,
on that
please.
point, Tom? So I agree with everything that Mallory just said. In the context of the conversation about whether the United States ought to free itself from the New START constraints, one of the arguments is that right now the United States, given the modernization that has been undertaken in Russia, that is ongoing in China, it doesn't have anything to bring to the table to incentivize Russia and China to agree on some kind of new arms control arrangement, and that additional nuclear weapons could provide some leverage. Is that true? I think reasonable people can disagree. But as Mallory highlighted, both Russia and China have made it clear what U.S. capabilities they are very concerned about. And one of those is missile defense. So in my view, we shouldn't take what might be our strongest points of leverage a priori off the table. Now, does that mean we take measures to limit defenses in a way that would never pass muster in our own political system? Not necessarily, but it doesn't seem prudent to me to take what could be, our strongest leverage off the table even before we go into the negotiation. And likewise, I think it's fair for us to expect, given if we're going to have a conversation about defenses, given the developments that both Russia and China are undertaking in this sphere, that they come to the table willing to talk about their defenses as well. So I just wanted to add that to the mix.
Thanks. Steve, let me read this question for you and then maybe expand it a little bit. If you were President Putin or President Xi, and you are in a crisis involving the United States, does your basic decision calculus change if the U.S. has a net numerical advantage in strategic deployed warheads?
Well, the short answer would be no. I don't think it really has, and I don't think there is any historical evidence that the nuclear balance influenced the outcome of crises. We just take the situation over Ukraine. Do you think that if the U.S. had had 1,000 more warheads, strategic or tactical, that would have influenced Putin's calculation? It's just hard for me to see the logic where he would have said, oh, no, now I see I'm outmatched. It's often said, I think following Tom Schelling, that it's a game of risk-taking, of competition, right? And I don't think how many warheads you have, having another 1,000 really influences that risk-taking competition very significantly. It's about, whether the first one would be used, not whether the 1,000th one would be used. So, no, I don't think that the nuclear balance really influences the outcome of crises meaningfully, not once countries, both sides have a survivable retaliatory force.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it involves a lot of trying to read the minds of distant leaders, some of whom we know have thought long and hard about nuclear scenarios, and some who have hardly thought at all about nuclear scenarios. And that makes it really difficult to predict, but I think I agree with your answer. Let me ask a creative question here and then expand it a bit. Would a tripartite agreement to ratify the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, be a viable option to stabilize the trilateral dynamic? And let me expand that a little bit. Can you think of other things? This is an opportunity to be creative, of imaginative, creative, innovative things that any of these three leaders might be able to put on the table that would change the direction of what is already an arms race. Anybody? Or just answer the CTBT one, as you wish.
I mean, there's a lot of incremental things that could be done that would help, right? I mean, I think there's been good discussion of bringing China potentially into the National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center communication system, right? Providing notifications of treaty regimes, but also providing a capacity to communicate to prevent, miscalculation. There's suggestions of, making sure that we can entrench strategic stability dialogues in a way that they can't be sort of offset by politics as easily. Just making sure there's lines of communication and capacity to appreciate each other's threat perceptions in a way that allows for the prevention of unintentional escalation, right? And I think these are all very incremental, not as really amazing as a CTBT trilateral sort of agreement would be. And that would be amazing. I think the challenge is to get to that level, we have to overcome so many historical sort of inconsistent approaches to these points. We have to overcome the politics and the legal restraints, and then really overcome the challenge by the majority of our community in the deterrence arena that we can't verify these commitments, right? The verification is always a big problem. So if we could build in the utilization of emerging technologies, AI, and space sensors in a way that could actually make verification possible, maybe that becomes more a reality. But there's a lot of, I always think we're only limited by our own creativity in things that we could take to reduce risk, even if small, and seemingly very iterative. I think we should still try to take those steps.
I think it would be wonderful if we could somehow get to that point. And although some former Trump administration officials argued for resuming nuclear testing, if somehow President Trump himself became convinced that this was a good initiative, then, as you mentioned, the Republican senators would fall in line and ratify something that would be impossible with a Democratic president, as we've seen twice. And then if the US ratified, China would ratify, Russia would re-ratify. On verification, the existing verification system is very good, but the US has already offered to have site visits to improve, verification of subcritical, that existing testing is subcritical. So I think it's an interesting idea that I hope could be explored.
I'll just say briefly on the CTBT point that I agree with what Steve said. One potential complication would be, and I'll refer you to several of the recent State Department compliance reports on this score, that there is concern about both Russia and China's adherence to a zero yield interpretation of not in terms of the scope issue, but in terms of testing activities that may be inconsistent with a zero yield interpretation of the CTBT. There are, I think, ratification and entry into force of the agreement would provide additional tools in the toolkit to address those concerns. And
Yes.
There's an organization by the name of the Arms Control Association that has also suggested some interesting transparency measures that could be pursued to try and address those concerns as well.
And maybe just a two-finger on Steve's point and Kingston's point is that if we can start by sitting down and saying this is what zero yield means to us, how does that threaten us, right? Why is that a challenge to do if we can just say these are the interpretive elements that we bring to this treaty discussion, and let's discuss that and then build from there. And I think site visits is, again, a good iterative way to ultimately get to the goal that you mentioned of a trilateral sort of adherence and ratification of the CTBT.
And that could even include the confidence building measures that
Absolutely.
we're willing to offer at the test site.
Exactly.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not terribly impressed by three proud, confident powers saying, "You go first." No, you go first. No, this is not responsible leadership on the part of any of the three. But of course, it was a planted question because I wanted to talk about creative ideas. And it should be what not only the Arms Control Association, but so many of our partners in the field are all about. So I do want to recommend to everyone a publication that we made last year. Kelsey Davenport and others were key authors to it, about the concept of nuclear disarmament summits or nuclear summits. President Obama accomplished a great deal, not everything, but a great deal in the nuclear security field with a series of summits. And I think that there is every potential for one of the nuclear five or possibly another state to say we need a summit meeting, not to negotiate a global disarmament, but to agree on certain basic important principles and to begin a process. I don't know which country has the confidence to take the lead like that, but I do recommend this great publication from last year in the ACA oeuvre. Anything else you'd like to conclude about getting us onto an off-ramp?
Just, we can't give up.
Okay.
I think just the one thing I will say, and I think in the can't give up vein, is there, particularly on the arms control front, even if the prospects seem dim at the moment, there is value in thinking through proposals and ultimately developing proposals and even putting them on the table, not only to force a response on the part of Russia and China to engage seriously, but it's been some time since there's been a meaningful arms control negotiation. Expertise and talent and competencies have atrophied, and there's a need to reinvigorate and revitalize the ability of the U.S. Broader system, both inside and outside of government, to be able to engage in a conversation like this. Because there have been bleak times in the past where the thinking was that arms control was yesterday's thing and it's not going to happen again. And it turned out things changed. The geopolitical situation changed and opportunities arose. And it's important to prepare for that now. So, and that reflects the importance of the work that you all are doing, that we're still trying to do to prepare for that potential opportunity.
And I can agree with that. I like to remind people that no matter how grim things may look right now, things can change dramatically, very quickly. As we saw in the 1980s. In 1985, things looked very grim. I remember very distinctly. But just 2 years later, a dramatic difference.
People change things.
People change things, and people demand change from leaders.
And so as Kingston said, we have to be ready to take advantage of the opportunity when it comes.
Thanks. Well, when I look at how difficult it might be to resist the forces driving the arms race, I kind of think of what Ukrainians say to each other, which is, to resist is difficult, to surrender is fatal. So thank you very much, and please thank our panelists today.